one which is widely discussed. What is the impact of the City of London on employment elsewhere? What is the impact of everything that we do here elsewhere? One of the key areas in which Just Share likes to bring about discussion and debate. And for our evening today, we've got a panel with a wide range of experience. We have Aidan McQuade, who was a director of Anti-Slavery International and is now working independently, but he'll explain to you a little more what he does today. We have Katherine Chapman, a director at the Living Wage Foundation, and she'll introduce herself also more extensively. And Siobhan Martin, executive director HR at Mercer, UK and Ireland. Mercer is one of our neighbours and is a company that spans the globe, and so therefore have a direct experience of employment practice throughout the planet. So I think without further ado, I'll introduce Aidan, but just to say that two of the speakers, Aidan and Siobhan, are both jet-lagged, having travelled quite a distance, so we're going to need engaging questions to keep the debate going afterwards, so do make sure that your minds are razor sharp and that you contribute to the discussion afterwards. We'll have, after the question and answers, there will be a time for refreshments and individual conversations to continue for those who want. So Aidan, without further ado, a view from, anti-slavery and law.
Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me all right? Is the accent okay? That can sometimes be a problem, I know. My wife continually complains that I mumble all the time, so if I'm mumbling at any stage, please give me a wave and I'll try not to do that. There we go. Most recent estimates of the number of people in slavery in the world today are around 40 million. The question sometimes asked is, given all that Wilberforce and Lincoln and Buxton and various others did in the 19th century, we were told that this was a problem we'd solved. And yet there's tens of millions of people in slavery across the world today. And the reasonable question to ask is, why is that? And the simple enough reason is that because we never really abolished it. There's an Irish patriot called Roger Casement, who was a very distinguished anti-slavery activist at the end of the 19th century. I think he said that slavery was never really abolished, it was just deregulated. Or there's another way to look at it. We have slavery today because we don't call it slavery. In the Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula, it's called the kafala system, which is a system which is used to enslave tens of thousands of South Asian workers in order to do, among other things, construct the venues for the World Cup in 2022 in Qatar. At the rate of death and corporate manslaughter at the moment in relation to those building sites, this is likely to be the bloodiest sporting event since the Caesars stopped organising gladiatorial games. In the UK, they use a system which is very similar to kafala, which is tied visas for overseas domestic workers. So again, within the UK, there's tens of thousands of people who have been trafficked here essentially under licence from the UK Home Office for domestic servitude. Now, this has been pointed out repeatedly to the Home Secretaries, both Theresa May and Amber Rudd, but yet they don't see their way around to getting rid of this system. It's not slavery because it's not called slavery. In South Asia, simply rule of law does not apply for the hundreds of millions of people who are Dalits and Adivasi there, and so forming a category of people who are easily enslavable. In Western Europe, of course, and also in Southeast Asia, those who are enslaved tend to be migrant workers. And so as we see the rising tide of xenophobia and racism across the UK, particularly post-Brexit, we're seeing an environment being increased and worsened for the enslavement of human beings within it. But it's okay, because we're not calling that slavery, we're calling it other euphemisms which allow us to get past this. So, to put it most simply, if we want to end slavery, we have to oppose it in practical terms as well as in principle. We have to recognise it as being the political issue that it is, because it emerges from the law and policy which we use to govern the way in which we do business and do trade and prepare our young people for the adult world and produce development policy across the world and anti-poverty poverty policy. These are all political products, and within the gaps and flaws of that policy is where the opportunities for slavery emerge and forced labour. And so if we are looking for ethical supply chains, if we're looking for a society which is truly one where slavery has been eradicated, it requires us to all call out for this, these problems as citizens, and that's as corporate citizens as well. It's easy for business to say, look, we have a nice policy, it's against slavery. But if that policy isn't effectively implemented all the way down the supply chain, that's going to be quite meaningless. And it's going to be very difficult for that policy to be implemented if the governments along the supply chain from the UK all the way down to the global south, if they're not putting in place the systems that are necessary in order to protect the human rights of workers within those countries where the supply chains stretch. So businesses need to recognise themselves as political actors as well, and to speak out on issues of human rights in the same way as they have hitherto spoken out on issues like tariff policy, tax policy, trade policy. Human rights must be recognised as a fundamental issue for business in the same way as it should be recognised as a fundamental issue for the rest of us as human beings. And so it's within that context I think I would like us to look at the issue of slavery, not as an issue from which people need to be rescued, but an issue which people need to be empowered to fight against, and one which was a political issue, not simply one of narrow criminal justice. And if we can at least conceptualize the problem in that way, then we have the potential to maybe do something about it in a way that up until now we have failed as a human society to do anything about. So there'll be a chance to chat more about this as the evening progresses, so I'll just leave that there. I'll hand over to my other colleagues on the panel.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep. I'm Katherine Chapman. I'm Director of the Living Wage Foundation. We are a UK-based charity at the moment, but we are starting to look more internationally, and I think the sort of lessons that we've learned and the kind of principles of what we do here have got much broader applicability in terms of how you can work with businesses in a kind of ethical international context. Just a bit of a word about the living wage itself and what it is. I'm sure many of you may have heard of the phrase, the living wage, and the movement or the campaign really kind of kicked off. You know, for a long time the phrase has been around. I think it was used by Winston Churchill amongst others. But essentially it's the concept that if someone is going out and doing a hard day's work, a fair day's work, they should be able to earn a wage that they can live a decent quality of life on. And the campaign itself kicked off in earnest really about 15, 16 years ago, particularly around cleaners in East London, so actually very much a city-focused campaign. It was organised by community organisers who are part of Citizens UK, the charity that organises civil society institutions including churches, synagogues, mosques, universities and so on. And there were many cleaners within their networks that were having to work 2, sometimes 3 minimum wage jobs back in 2001. They were getting up at 4, 5 in the morning to get buses across London to go and clean offices in the City of London, getting home at kind of 10 at night just to make ends meet. So they had no time for family life, they had no time for community life. So it was a social justice and also a community and civic issue about building strong citizens who could take, to use your word, not being done to them, but realising what needed to be done here. So they came together and decided to campaign on a living wage. And the first London living wage was calculated actually by the Mayor of London's office in 2005. And they took these messages to some of the employers in the city and had their first wins. And there's this wonderful story of Abdul, who's a cleaner at HSBC, and he went to the HSBC AGM and he stood up and he spoke to Sir John Bond, the then chairman, and said, we share the same office, but we live in different worlds. And he explained his life. And at that moment of kind of breaking down that understanding, HSB decided to become one of the first living wage employers. So it's grown since then, and in 2011, the Living Wage Foundation was set up, which I now have the privilege of leading, to formally accredit employers with the Living Wage Employer Badge. And to sign up to that, it's paying all direct employed staff a living wage, but also crucially the on-site contractors. And so that's picking up cleaners, catering, security staff, who are often the hidden face of low pay. And in London, that workforce can often be very diverse, a lot of migrant labour. So it's using that power of the supply chains in our own country at the moment to make change happen. It's just to be really clear, there's a London living wage and there's a UK living wage rate. And at the moment, it's the London living wage is £9.75 an hour, and the UK rate is £8.45 an hour. And that compares to the highest of the government minimum wages, also confusingly called the national living wage, which was a victory for us, which is £7.50 an hour. So it's about £1 an hour, £2 an hour difference, and that does make a real difference to people's lives. Now, just a word on why this is so important, that there is unfortunately still a huge problem and picture of in-work poverty in the UK. We know that nearly 1 in 5 workers in the UK are earning below the real living wage, which means they can be struggling to make ends meet. And 2/3 of children in poverty, growing up in poverty in the UK, are in households where at least someone is in work. So something is going wrong here in terms of our over-reliance on low-pay sectors. And of course, you just have to have a kind of a cursory glance at the news at the moment, that there has been a lot of coverage of the increases in the costs of living, high inflation, possibly linked to Brexit, and this disproportionately affects those on low incomes. So this is a problem that is not going to go away, and if anything, it's going to get worse with the economic uncertainty that's ahead. The good news is that at the moment, over 3,500 employers are voluntarily signing up with us to pay the real living wage across the UK. We actually just announced our 3,500th employer last week, which was a London florist, which was a lovely story, because it goes to show that small businesses can do this as well as large businesses. And that includes about 1/3 of the FTSE 100 companies, many of which, of course, are based in the city, as well as big household names like IKEA, Google, ITV, and so on, as well as thousands of smaller firms. 3,500 employers is great, but we want to see that number grow, and we're doing everything we can to see that number grow. And just to sort of get on your radars, Living Wage Week is actually the first week of November, where the new London living wage and UK living wage rates will be announced on Monday, the 6th of November. And the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, will actually be announcing the London rate as well. So, just thinking about this in terms of the international context, which I know is a focus for today's discussion. So whilst we are UK-based at the moment, many of the companies that work with us are, of course, multinational companies. We have an advisory board, and companies like Burberry and Linklaters and lots of KPMG city firms sit on that. And over the past couple of years, there has been a real and growing discussions globally about how living wages can be something that's paid throughout the rest of the world, linked to Sustainable Development Goals about tackling poverty and inequality. And there's also clearly a link to modern slavery. We've started to do some work at the foundation on that, thinking how can we try and create more of a unified global movement to help this spotlight on low pay, and particularly ensuring living wages for all around the globe. And I think it's certainly something that international businesses are looking at, but there is also an argument that you have to also look at what's happening at home and in your home turf, and there is a problem in the UK of in-work poverty. A couple of sort of final thoughts to leave on. I suppose the first is of course the supply chain issue, which is actually critical to this. The whole concept of the living wage came from that recognition that as an employer, your workforce should be an inclusive approach. It's everyone who helps make your business run, who cleans your offices, that should be recognised, and there is a responsibility and duty on that employer to take that into account, and the same applies internationally in global supply chains. Secondly, an interesting angle that I think is rising up the agenda is the ethical investment angle. There's some ethical investment movements now, particularly led by organisations like Share Action, which are making the case that as investors in companies, you should be looking at some of these indicators as well before you invest in companies. And there has been some work done on, and we're about to do some work looking at the living wage as something that investors should be looking at where they're considering which companies they choose to invest in or not. And finally, there's the role of the consumer, and one of the reasons that we have the logo and we want to promote it is because there's obviously thinking about how you can harness the power of the consumer to want to purchase goods and services from ethical employers, including paying a decent wage to all staff. I'll leave it there again so there's more time for questions, but that's a bit of an overview about what we do at the Living Wage and the history of the movement really, but also how we might seek to grow in the future. So thank you.
Hi everybody, my name's Siobhan and I work at a company that is a big employer here in the city and is a big employer globally. I work for Mercer. We're part of the Marsh & McLennan Group. We employ 60,000 people around the world in 140 countries, and we here in the city have about 800 employees right next door to this church where we are tonight. So I'm talking to you as an employer to follow through on some of the things that Aidan and Katherine have spoken about, and also as a human being who's extremely concerned about the rights of others and how we can make live ethical lives and ensure that everybody has the benefit of that. So just a few things that I'd like to touch upon and then perhaps draw out a little bit further when we speak is the two critical topics that have already been raised. So ensuring that we don't have slavery in our supply chain. It is clear that as an employer, it is quite straightforward for us in a UK context to ensure that we don't have, we're not operating in a system of modern slavery for the people who are on our workbooks here. But then, as Aidan has said to us, then we have to think about all of the goods and services that we procure, and that becomes a much more difficult question. Can we ever be sure that that is that we are living to that and that is not happening in our supply chain? We really can't. However, we have to make steps, and we do make sure that we take the steps to ensure that everything that we're aware of, we are following through on, that we're always asking questions. I am also asked lots of questions when we apply for tenders and put out work to other companies, and I think this is extremely important for us, that we should always be asking others too, not just to sign a piece of paper, to really look as far as they possibly can, I think is extremely important, to always be asking those questions. Also to ensure, of course, that we do pay people fairly and so that they can live, and as Katherine has said, not just exist, but have a family life, have a life that's worth living. This is extremely important to us. So to do that, we make sure that we audit regularly all of the people that work for us and that we pay, so that through any measure, it is that we can be sure that we're meeting the high standards that are rightly set for us by the Living Wage Commission. One of the other things that's extremely important for us, again, thinking about this for policy and compliance purposes, is we have a code of practice that all of our employees must adhere to called the greater good. And we set out in that exactly what it is that we require of everybody who's part of our business and who does business with us. And then help people to understand what that truly means, because of course it's really quite straightforward to sign up to various policies and procedures, but it's when it comes to things that are sticky, that are more grey, that are harder, that things can go horribly wrong. So we ensure and make it mandatory that everybody who works for us has both read the materials but also really engaged in them in a meaningful way. And to that end, we made videos and films of scenarios that occur and that raise important ethical questions, particularly in an international context, because of course our employees here in the UK are doing business around the world. And so what we might think is not correct and not right in the UK context, and all fully understand. When you move to other parts of the world, how might that play out? So it's been extremely important to us to help people understand that the higher standard is always the standard to which we must meet, no matter where we're doing business in the world. And I think if we take a little bit further from some of the things we've already talked about today into other areas of ethical behaviour, how do we treat, for example, our LGBTQI individuals? That's an issue here in the UK that we're feeling more and more comfortable about as a community, and that's fantastic, and we hold ourselves to very high standards. But of course, we do business in other parts of the world where things are very different. And sadly also some of those are in the Commonwealth countries, for which we are also very connected as a nation in the UK. So we believe that we have a very strong moral duty to ensure that not just people here on this shores but in other parts of the world are protected, and that we raise our voice against things that are very, well, we would see as very wrong. There are other things, of course, too. There is the ethics about how we treat men and women. We've heard a lot about the gender pay gap in the UK recently, and it's really great that that's come very much to the forefront, and you'll know that the UK government has a requirement now that we report about gender pay gap. Unfortunately, the legislation is a blunt instrument and doesn't necessarily serve what we would prefer it that it did, but it does raise the issue and encourages us all to ensure that we are doing what is right. We participate in audits as a company. We interrogate our own data to ensure that we know exactly what's going on, and then not just take it and say, oh, well, that's how it is, but then what are we actually going to do about that, and hold ourselves to that very high standard. And another area that very much comes to my mind is about how we treat people who have mental ill health. And there was a very important piece of research that was released by Business in the Community, part of the Prince's Trust, 2 weeks ago. That was a survey of UK employees. It was an excellent and wide-ranging survey done with YouGov. And we learnt from that 60% of employees have experienced mental ill health at work due to their work, and that a staggering 15% of workers who said they disclosed their mental health issues reported that they faced disciplinary action, dismissal or demotion as a result of that. And that is absolutely unfair. 15% of a very large sample is absolutely wrong. So, as an employer, we encourage other employers to take that very seriously and to consider all of the things that can be done to address and ensure that everyone, again, is protected and served well by them. So, there are lots of other things I could say, but perhaps we will engage in some discussion together and draw some of those things out. And if I could just leave on an optimistic note, I hope, that I heard Ed Miliband talking the other day, who drew me to the attention of a great phrase from Theodore Parker, who was a slavery abolitionist, who said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I hope that we can all bend in that direction. Thank you.
Well, a wide-ranging array of issues to think about. Aidan's slant on slavery and how easily it is to still today be unaware of who is actually doing what for us. And I'm sure there's more to be explored about that, and perhaps some more concrete examples. And then Katherine on the living wage, and an important issue about how much do we pay people. And we've, I suppose everyone is aware of fair trade, and there's been a lot of campaigning about that, but are people really then keen to pay fairly and pay more for the goods they buy, and particularly relevant in the gig economy, I would have thought, where we buy on our smartphones and then don't have no idea what people are being paid, and some of them camping outside the warehouses for very little pay indeed. And then expanding to other issues of equality and fairness, with Siobhan, I think how we, in a society culture like ours, we are able still to take a lead and move on practice around the globe. And so there may be perhaps some questions more about how a business like Mercer and many others can actually affect change when culturally things may be okay somewhere else. And so perhaps a little more to hear about that. But any questions that anyone would like to ask to a particular speaker at this stage?
A question for everybody on the panel, if I may. Obviously, on a day-to-day basis, you're involved in engaging with people and indeed with organisations to, discuss these topics and so on. Sort of a two-stage question coming out of that. Firstly, if you're dealing with an organisation or an individual who's not particularly, shall we say, immediately open to the topics for discussion, I'd be interested to know how you sort of approach the subjects, that sort of thing, and what the practical approach would be. And then on a more personal approach for perhaps us as individuals here in the audience, how can we engage as consumers or just as everyday individuals with people and organisations in a productive fashion? I'd be deeply interested to know more. Thank you.
Aidan, do you want to work with this microphone? Or do you want to work it? You need to hold it near to you.
I'll try this, really. It would be nice if people were more easily persuadable. If you look at the grand mass of humanity, they're not that persuadable with sweet reason alone. I think whenever you have seen significant shifts in the way in which business is done over the past 10 years, indeed over human history, let's be honest, but it's usually as a consequence of pretty sharp confrontation. Confrontation can then lead to dialogue to collaboration, but too frequently I think there's often that need for that sharp confrontation. I've just come back from Indonesia, where I was doing work with a chocolate company called Mondelez, which took over Cadbury's a few years ago. One of the reasons the chocolate companies are doing, I think the chocolate companies as a whole are probably the most advanced industry on this, in terms of sorting out their supply chains. And part of the reason for that goes back to, I think, 2003, when I think it was Channel 4 produced a film called Chocolate Secret Slaves. And a lot of the chocolate companies were old Quaker companies, many of them with their roots in the anti-slavery movement. And this really was quite a shock to the system for them. And so they did things like they set up the International Cocoa Initiative, which is a broad-based organisation with trade unions as well as businesses on its board, in order to begin to engage with the issue of child labour in its supply chains. And certainly all the consumer-facing retailers have got their own initiatives to complement that as well. If you look back to the Bangladesh Fire Safety Accords from a couple of years ago, they came directly out of the Rana Plaza catastrophe. It seems that 1,000 deaths is what you need in order to stir the consciences of governments and businesses alike, more often than not, because week in, week out, there had been fires right through the garment sector in Bangladesh, killing dozens of young women with very little comment and no action. So it's those sorts of things seem to be what's necessary in order to shake things up. Now, I'd prefer if it was possible to simply approach people and say, hey, you're doing bad stuff. But I think one needs to understand this within the dynamics of organisations where there's always lots and lots of things going on and lots of calls on people's time. So how does one raise those sort of moral concerns to actionable level? And that brings us back then to the question of one can do as individuals, and I think that is to be awkward, to raise your voice, to write letters, to tweet, to do all of those things in order to engage businesses so that they're aware that there's a lot of people who are concerned about these things. Because whenever businesses open their mouths is whenever governments tend to act. I'd been pestering the British government for quite a while about transparency clause in the UK in relation to supply chains. Not one blind bit of interest did the government have in anything that I said. British business then went to the UK government with exactly the same proposal. So, oh, that's a good idea, let's do that. And you know, they would not have done it if civil society had been the only ones asking for it. And the truth is, the voice of business carries more weight with government than the voice of conscience. And so business acting as corporate citizens on these issues is important as well. And if you're a professional in any sphere, think about how you may be able to use your power as a professional, not just as an ordinary individual, in order to emancipate where it's possible. It's not always possible, but thinking of where the possibilities may arise can be very helpful.
Thank you. I would agree with the focus on kind of leadership and having to ask the difficult questions. I think the Living Wage campaign back in its kind of 2001 when it was kicking off, there was a lot of kind of organising done by Citizens UK, which was bringing together these real people who'd experienced low pay and showcasing their stories in the media and taking them to the powers that be in the business community. So at the AGM example I gave, we found that telling those personal stories does have an impact, showing both the public and the business community what life is like. And I suppose with the living wage, there was quite a simple answer for what the business could do about it. So there's that simple sort of awareness raising and telling those stories. As we've grown as a movement and more businesses have signed up, that business peer-to-peer pressure definitely has helped. So we know now that businesses are some of our best advocates for this, going and talking to other businesses about how and why they've done it. Linked to that is, I suppose, the point that which is leadership in corporate citizen leadership, having those champions who are prepared to tell their stories. We also, you know, on a kind of, if you were to think of it as a carrot and the stick, the carrot side is we've done a lot of work as well that actually shows there are significant business and economic benefits to paying a living wage, in the form of, you know, if you pay people better, they want to work for you, and your retention rates will increase, your absenteeism and sickness will go down, and you will have a more engaged workforce. So there's that kind of side of the arguments as well. And then some of the other drivers, the investors is a significant influence on the business community. I mean, what we're about here is about changing business behaviour. So this is about how you influence businesses. So there's that kind of, that as a driver. If investors start asking questions, then businesses will also listen. And then there's a consumer angle. So the more that you can show that people are prepared to look for, in our case, the living wage employer mark, some businesses will listen to that. Interestingly, there's, related to the consumer piece really, is the rise of ethical, the millennials argument. We did a piece of research recently with the NUS, which showed, perhaps not surprisingly, but 93% of graduates want to work for a living wage employer, not because they would be impacted by the living wage, but because they want to go and work for companies that are seen to be reputable. This is rising up the agenda amongst young people, and that's another dynamic that I think can be sort of brought into play. So in terms of what we can do in this room, I'd echo what Aidan said. In your kind of professional capacity, you can ask the question, is your employer a living wage employer? And we also have a big kind of social media element to what we do. I'm very happy to circulate things after this meeting. Living Wage Week, when the new rates are announced, is a good point actually of kind of getting on board and kind of helping us to amplify and share our messages. So I can send through details of how to get involved with that. And then I suppose thirdly is in your role as a consumer, look out for the living wage logo. As we grow our high street presence, it will be easier to start purchasing living wage goods and services. Because absolutely agree with your point about there is a hidden cost. Things are cheap, but someone is paying the price. And the more that people start to ask that question, the more that we can sort of use that influence to bear as well.
So exactly what Katherine and Aidan have said has applied pressure to us as an employer, and it's worked. So it's great. And so therefore we apply pressure to other people that we do business with. Fantastic. And on it goes. And it's as we've heard, the race sadly is a long way from being done, may never be, but we can use the power. So we can use the power of our voice, and recognising sadly that it is true that business does tend to have more sway in certain places, well then it is absolutely our moral imperative to make sure that we don't just sit back, that we speak like we are here today, and that we use the power of that, the power with our own population, but also the people that we do business with. And then, as both Aidan and Katherine have said, that we must then ensure that as individuals we use our voices too and make all those things happen. And that we ask people to comply with the requirements that we have, but don't just comply because you've ticked a piece of paper, but fully follow through on that. What does that actually mean? What's actually happened? How can you evidence that? And I so agree with, you must ask questions of business, because it is by asking us these things that emails get sent round or messages get asked and phone calls are made, and then people are told that they have to do something about it. And that's a really good thing. It was some years ago now that when I first came to the UK 13 years ago, that for the first time, I'd been asked to, as an employer, assert to all sorts of different things on behalf of people that we were doing business with. For example, that we were allowing all of our staff to go home at the end of the day, that we weren't locking them up in cages at night, and that people were fed and given water during the day. And these were questions I thought, I can't believe I'm in London and I have a professional workforce. I can't believe I'm having to assert this. I'm having to assert this because there are lots of companies for whom that would not be true. So that was a great moment of eye-opening for me, and for all of the people that work for us too, because then we started a campaign internally to let people know that this is, it's true for us, it's great, but it's not true for many millions of people in the world today. So we need to do our bit as the power of consumer and the power of employers. So on we go.
Any other questions? I think
I just wanted to ask Katherine a little bit more about, you're talking about rolling out the living wage to other countries, and just to explain a little bit how you do that, how you calculate it, are you just talking about multinationals trading in other countries, or are you talking about local companies? And if so, how do you address issues of competitiveness?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And the honest answer is we're at the beginning of all of this. And I suppose just to be clear, it's not us kind of trying to set global wages internationally. It's more of trying to convene the international community and interested parties around the world to think about, if we're going to do this, or you're interested in setting up an accreditation scheme akin to ours in another country, let's try and move towards a common model so that it's replicable and we can kind of help promote it in a more comprehensive and joined up way. So we've brought together some stakeholders, and we had some living wage dialogues over the summer around the country that brought together, and this is critical to it, it has to be a multi-stakeholder approach. So civil society organisations, NGOs, trade unions, academics and employers. And it's kind of starting to build that consensus that this might be a good thing to do, to join together on this. The big challenge is how is calculating the living wage. So there are obviously lots of different ways of calculating it. We've worked incredibly hard in the UK to get it to the simplicity and the trust in our rate, which is based on a transparent method and all the rest of it. So I think one of the approaches that might work pragmatically is to have a set of principles, of 6 principles, which we've developed over the past couple of years that people could adhere to in doing this. But there are, of course, loads of challenges raised, and you've touched on some, the issue of ensuring it's a completely different conversation in one part of the country or in a really developing country where there's nothing close to a minimum wage, and the living wage can't be seen as a sticking plaster for that. So there's a whole load of issues that have to be considered. So there's probably an exercise in kind of prioritising, well, where could a model like ours work appropriately, and where is it about working much more in partnership to support existing or nascent minimum wage and living wage campaigns. So it's very much a long-term goal, and it's more in the case of bringing people together to think, how can we progress this? Because it's a completely different context in a developed economy like the UK, which has a deregulated labour market, compared to even our European sort of brother and sister countries, where there's a tripartite and collective bargaining on the part of unions, so it's a completely different context altogether. So it's early days, and we've probably raised a number of issues rather than necessary solutions, but I think it's about having a set of principles that we're aiming to adhere to, and then thinking about how we could join that up so that companies that we've got sort of bought in at the UK level can start thinking about doing this in other places around the world. And I should say there are other actors in this space. Of course, there are Global Living Wage Coalition, are an international group that are starting to look at setting benchmarks in developing countries for what a living wage might be. So there's lots of building blocks out there. It's about joining it up and sharing what we've learnt in our kind of 16 years in the UK to help support where we can.
I wanted to ask a question of Aidan, really, on slavery, and the Church of England is about to launch a campaign on identifying the slaves within a community. So it's about how we notice people around us who might be in position of servitude. And there was obviously quite a lot of organizations working against slavery. There was Stop the Traffic and all sorts of... But we haven't heard about the Doha football stadium building stuff for a long time, for instance. Why do these things get the headline 1 minute and then we all forget about it because it's probably more exciting to have the football? And having links, this church having links with the Middle East and the Gulf in particular, where some of the congregations in the Christian compounds come from all these people who've been brought in for cheap labor and whose conditions are in a way unknown. What is being done to, in a difficult context, I guess, with the Emirates and all that, but can we influence where the culture is very much predicated on that kind of behavior?
I bring not peace but the sword, I think, is possibly the most important line to keep thinking about whenever one's talking about this issue, because there's many in positions of power who will like to tell you, we've got this sorted, don't worry about it, follow our agenda and everything will be grand. And I think a significant chunk of the discussion in relation to slavery at the moment has been hijacked with a focus on criminal justice only. So it is about courageous, doubtless square-jawed British police rescuing, cowering foreign, should be grateful foreigners from dubious circumstances, and aren't we great? And then, post-Brexit, the UK government goes and says, well, we share great close values with President Duarte in the Philippines, who's a self-confessed murderer. We wish to have important business deals with the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf states. We wish to develop new deals with India without any questioning about the nature of supply chains there as well, and so on and so forth. One of the things I think, aside from, I can give you the list of forced labour indicators. I can train anybody you want in terms of how to identify people on indicators of forced labour. what's, I think, important for institutions like the Church of England, for example, is to look at the laws and policies which are making slavery a probability within the countries in which they are, and to use its voice in order to call those to account, to bring not peace but the sword to the discussions. Because that's your job. And I've seen some folk, too many folk, in well-meaning, the Catholic Church, let's speak of my own lot, who seem to wish that the most important thing in relation to this discussion is in order to have cocktails with Theresa May, rather than actually change the circumstances in which people are enslaved. And I suspect that's going on with more than just the Catholic Church. I think critical faculties in relation to what's going on in slavery in the world have been ignored, and consequently not speaking out on behalf of those that should be spoken out for. I mean, if you want to find people in slavery in London today, a very good place to go is Mass on a Sunday morning in some of the wealthier parts of London, where Filipino housemaids finally get out for a bit. And I've sat in front of senior churchmen from the Catholic Church begging them to speak out on this issue. I have yet to hear a word on it. So I'll speak of my own, not of yours, but I would suggest, bring not peace but the sword to this discussion.
Any other question?
A question for Katherine, really. So I'm talking from UK perspective. So we have a wide range of employers in the UK, and there are lots of employers signed up on the living wage. We have some very small employers, and I'm sure someone might have asked this question in the past. The question really is that the people who can't, or the employers who can't afford the living wage, obviously if they start paying the living wage, there's a direct consequence of that on their people, staffing cost, things like that. How do you actually go about sort of putting your agenda to them and saying, but this is what you should be doing. You should be paying a living wage. How do you do that?
Can I just add a supplementary element to ask everyone, which is also why is it that we can't see that if people are less well paid, it's all subsidized by the state through our taxes in the end, because people are being paid through benefits, so the money is coming to them. So that's
on the businesses who can't afford it, I mean, obviously that's a common refrain we get. One thing to just point out that is often counterintuitive is that actually about 80-85% of those 3,500 employers are small businesses, because it comes back to the point about seeing your workforce as an investment and part of your business and the productivity of your business rather than a cost. In terms of the kind of impact and, like you say, having to make those difficult choices about how you do it, we've done a lot of, tried to get case studies and all this kind of information on it, because ultimately it's that mindset shift of seeing it's not a zero-sum game. Increases in wages doesn't have to mean cutting everything else. And employers who have implemented the living wage, we did some work on this recently, have not done it by cutting huge amount of hours and jobs. It's about looking again at what those jobs look like, at how your work is organised, how you could look at the roles in terms of cross-skilling and giving people development opportunities. And where we find the living wage has worked best for businesses is where they've introduced it alongside looking again at use of 0 hours contracts, management and training and progression. So actually, Brewdog, to give you an example, they're the kind of punk beer company. I don't know if you've heard of them. They seem to be in all the shops at the moment. They became an accredited living wage employer in 2014, and they have 45 bars as well as being a brewery, and the hospitality sector is endemic, low pay is endemic. So they're really bucking the trend in their industry by doing this. But when they introduced it, they decided, well, this is an opportunity to look again at the quality of those jobs. So they abolished 0 hours contracts. They introduced a new training and development program for people from kind of the bar floor to the management. And they introduced the living wage. And the result has meant that their staff turnover's dropped, their employees are staying rather than leaving, which happens a lot in that industry. They've got more internal promotions, the quality of service to the customer has gone up. So it's kind of offsetting a lot of the initial costs. So it's introducing that kind of side to it with examples, with case studies of how employers have done it. And then, of course, there's the brand benefit side to it, that, you know, you will get a boost to your brand reputation, which is not inconsiderable. IKEA signed up last year, which was a huge moment for us. It was a pay rise for kind of nearly 7,000 co-workers across the country. And it was a real milestone for the movement because it showed that it was possible in a retail context where labour costs were the majority of costs, and also not in a particularly high-end retailer, if I can put it that way. And they've done this by planning for the long term. They plan over a kind of 10-year timescale, and they've looked at all these costs in the round, and they've chosen to do it. But I suppose, you know, it's not to take away from the central point that this is about a business demonstrating its values and living its values, and that is still the kind of primary driver, I would say, for most businesses signing up when we've explored this. The living wage is a very good way of putting your money where your mouth is, in that you're saying we really do care about the bottom line experience of our employees, and that mindset and outlook is why many sign up in the first instance. Your point about the tax revenues, absolutely, and the campaign before my time, but made that case about obviously higher wages saves the exchequer in benefits, and I think, you know, in many ways, when George Osborne announced the national living wage in 2015, which was a huge moment for the campaign, we'd influenced national policy, was of course partly that was because that message had landed. So, you know, that was the biggest increase in the minimum wage since it was announced, and that's definitely a factor to play. The other point I think that, you know, can't get made enough is obviously the benefits to a local economy. If people have more money, they will spend more. So it strengthens everyone in the long run. So the arguments are very compelling. It's helping us get them out there, and particularly in these kind of challenging times.
Anything else? I just wonder whether, one question to Siobhan really, why would companies not do it? Why would companies not embrace these values? What is given that CSR is so powerful in large organizations now, and investor relations and all that, and it's not addressed to, it's addressed to you as a business person, not your company, but...
Well, I think some of the answer to that is inherent in the question that we just had, is people thinking about it in these issues in a very short-term, without thinking about everything in the round, because all of the things that Katherine was just describing there, as an employer, what's my ability to recruit great talent and to keep them? Because I understand how it feels every day that you have the wage bill, but then if you haven't thought more broadly about how much it costs to, when you actually hire people, that can be a long and expensive process. When you keep losing people and you have to train them all over again, the experience that your customers have if you're in a service industry and all those different things, you have to think more broadly about it. But I understand that not everyone will be thinking that way, and that's the sort of stuff that gets in the way. You need to think more broadly about all of those other things that are hidden, but that can be very expensive, not the least of which is when we all as consumers not gravitate towards certain products because they're not doing a good thing, then they're not getting our money and they're not going to grow and develop and do well. So I would thoroughly encourage everybody to be on board with these things, and not to be blind to all those other costs.
Well, I think it's time to bring to a close and to thank our three panelists. And they sound hopeful. I don't know, really. Are we hopeful that change is coming? Always hopeful. Okay, good. So Aidan and Siobhan have travelled a long distance, but well, and Katherine will be staying for during some further conversations for personal questions, I guess, or more, continue the conversation in a more informal setting. It's been good to have you and all those who've been watching on Facebook and live stream also, and good to have you also. A round of applause to our panelists, and thank you for coming to our event. There are more events planned for Just Share on our website. We've been slightly in between coordinators, which means that the program is only slowly re-engaging, but we have a full program all the way to the end of next year and beyond, so do check the website. Thank you.